Hello and welcome to this second video about section 21 in the syllabus in IGCSE Biology. Again, apologize for the bad setup, bad lighting, bad camera, but this is what I have to work with right now as we are still in lockdown in this corona crisis. While everybody's talking about corona, there is another crisis or another situation that is going to have an impact on our way of life in the years to come, and that is greenhouse gases. And in this video, I will be talking about section 21.3 in the syllabus, part of it, which is pollution, in this case greenhouse gases. And if you're using the book, I will be talking about section 22.3 here in the book, greenhouse gases. Well, it has been known since the famous Swedish chemist Arrhenius discovered that CO2 is what we call a greenhouse gas. And you all probably heard this a million times from other teachers and Leonardo DiCaprio and so on, but just a short recap. CO2 is a gas in the atmosphere, and among other gases, they work as greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases work this way, that we have, like, this is supposed to be the Earth, and here we have the atmosphere. Again, be aware that this is drawing is way out of scale. The atmosphere is actually quite thin compared to the Earth. Now, as light comes from the sun, it comes as rather short wavelength. Some of it, of course, get blocked up here by the ozone layer. That is the UV light. But the visible light passes through the atmosphere. Otherwise, there would be no photosynthesis and you couldn't see anything. So all the visible light passes through the atmosphere, and during a hot summer day or even a spring day like today, the energy in that light will heat up the surface. If you ever walked on black tarmac on a summer day, you'll know what I mean. Now, hot objects give away infrared radiation. Infrared radiation has a different wavelength than visible light. And due to the chemical structure of molecules as CO2 and methane, they will tend to absorb some of that long wave radiation. And when they absorb it, well, that energy will then be reflected back at the surface. This means that those greenhouse gases work as kind of a blanket. And if you ever want to experience this yourself, you can try, if you ever had, a hot summer day, and then at night, when there's clouds, when there's no clouds, well, when there are clouds, they keep the warmth in. Without any clouds, even a warm summer day can have a cold night. You see that in deserts many places. So the greenhouse effect is that we have molecules that will absorb some of the longer wave radiation and reflect that light or energy back into the sun. And if we didn't have a greenhouse effect, the entire planet would be quite cool, somewhere between 15 and 30 degrees Celsius colder, which meant that we have a really serious ice age. So when people talk about the greenhouse effect as something dangerous, you just have to remember, without any greenhouse effect, our entire planet would look quite different. The problem is, of course, that normally we had somewhere around 250 to 320 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that CO2 is then taken in by plants through photosynthesis and released again through respiration. Some is, taken up by rocks, and some is released again by volcanoes. So we have a natural cycle where CO2 is taken up by plants and released again due to respiration, and where geological processes either release CO2 or take it up again. Now, this natural cycle has been disrupted by us humans by the fact that we use fossil fuels. So our use of oil, gas, and mainly coal lead to that a lot of carbon that has been stored underground for millions of years is now being released in huge amount into the atmosphere. And while we always burn stuff, we humans, before that we tend to use wood. And wood is what we call CO2 neutral. It means that the CO2 that you release when you burn a log of wood is some CO2 that was absorbed from the atmosphere a few years ago by the tree as it was growing. Because of that, burning stuff like wood or peat, stuff like that, is CO2 neutral because the CO2 you release is something that was in the atmosphere recently. But when we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon that hasn't been in the atmosphere for a long time. And this means that our concentration of CO2 is slowly this year, and this is concentration of CO2 is slowly going up year after year. There are ups and downs every year, but the general trend is that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing, and we're doing that, no doubt about it. Now, the problem with this is that as the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, we also keep more energy, as explained before, because it works as this blanket in the atmosphere. So as CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, we can expect temperature in the atmosphere to go up as well. Is it a problem? Well, it depends. I'll say it is because we have based our civilization and our economy on a climate that has been stable for the last couple of thousand years. So because it's stable climate, we have built our cities, our factories, our roads, everything in a special way. And that can be changed by global warming. Because some of the consequences of global warming can be that, one, we have a water level that will rise. The seas will swell, not only because you have melting of ice in the glaciers, in the Antarctic and the Arctic, but also because hot water simply expands and take up more space than cold water. So a higher water level means that most cities are built close to harbors. Look something like London, New York. These are huge cities that were built when sailing stuff in and out was where you build a city. So a small increase in sea level would mean a large increase in flood damage. A city like Miami is almost built for getting flooded. So this can lead to cities and areas getting flooded. And again, really rich cities, we might have technological fixes so we can fix it, but there are many third world countries where we don't have the technology or the resources just to have a quick technological fix of this. Another issue is we'll probably see more extreme weather, and by extreme weather I mean rainstorms, I mean hurricanes, and I mean forest fires. A warmer climate in general leads to warmer water, and warmer water leads to stronger tropical storms. It also leads to stronger rainfall when we have rain. It can also lead to drought and lead to more extreme forest fires like we've seen in the Amazon or like we've seen in Australia right now. And the last thing it is that it can lead to changes in biodiversity. Many animals are quite well adapted to where they live. For example, if you're a penguin, well, you kind of like cold water and ice. Um, Same if you're a polar bear, you like ice and seals. So if you have a very fast change in the climate, abrupt climate change, some of the species will not be able to adapt, and we will expect a lot of them to die out simply because the environment they adapted to is no longer there. So all this can have a lot of consequences, and it can have consequences for us humans as well. As you know, this will affect our cities, our farming, and the biodiversity that many of us depend on. You know, a small increase in ocean temperature will lead to different patterns of where fish are, and you're a fisherman, depending on the fish you can catch, it matters a lot if the fish are there or not. Um, it's important here to remember that while CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases, and perhaps the most important one, methane is also a very extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It stays in the atmosphere for a shorter time than CO2, but it's more powerful. And we get a lot of methane production when cows are farting and from rice fields. So the way we do farming has an impact on how much methane we release into the atmosphere. Also, there is a lot of methane bound today in permafrost in places like Siberia and Alaska. And if that permafrost, then defrosts, some of that methane could get released, which will lead to, higher temperature, which will lead to more permafrost melting, which will lead to more methane release, and then we can get into what we call a positive feedback cycle, where even if we try to stop global climate change, it can still move on. So that is why this is one of the most important goals in the UN World Goals, is to limit global climate change. This is why we have the Paris Agreement, to try to limit global climate change, and we do have all the knowledge to do so today. We have many of the technologies, but we are very fixed in our ways, and fossil fuels are extremely important in many places, so it's very hard for us humans to change. On a good note, on this here, and this is only my personal opinion, we have seen how entire society has changed during the last couple of weeks because of coronavirus. So it is possible for politicians to take rapid action when needed. So if we can act that so fast against something that on a global scale, although annoying, is a minor threat, well, if we did the same about climate change, we will fix this problem. If that is to be done, we'll see in the future. But for the IGCSE syllabus here, it's important to know that how CO2 is released, that fossil fuels and burning of fossil fuels will increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, that CO2 and methane and the others, they hold on to infrared radiation and thereby heat the atmosphere, and that this will lead to a gradual global warming that will have impact on on a lot of things in biology. Again, I do apologize for the bad setup, but I hope this makes sense. Otherwise, ask questions here below on YouTube, or ask them on School Plane or Teams for my class, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you for sticking around.